Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to tonight's keynote. My name is Ima de Vries. I will be moderating this session. I'm an assistant professor of New Media and Digital Culture here at Utrecht University, and I'm very happy to be moderating this session because it's about a topic that is very dear to my heart. It's also very dear to my students because it's what I teach. I teach a lot about how we think about technology, how we think about how technology can do stuff for us, has known so many iterations of optimism and pessimism that we are actually able to talk about a recurrence of some of the very ideas that still, I think, resonate today that we saw perhaps 100 years before. I'm also very happy that today's keynote is given by Julia Kloiber because she studied here. We actually found out that when she was a student at New Media and Digital Culture, we probably met but never really talked because she was in the class of February and I was mostly teaching in the class of September. So a very convenient moment to actually now for me find out what Julia was studying at the time, and I think most of the stuff that you'll talk about today, in a way, also was derived from what you did at the program. Julia is going to talk a lot about perhaps data. This is also something that she talked about a lot at other festivals, at other meetings, Future Fest lately. I think also in Poland there was a conference where Julia talked about how technology can help us improve our lives and help us make a better world. She also told me just now that, in a way, she also introduced herself mostly during her keynote. So a very warm welcome and applause for Julia Kloiber.
Hi, thanks for coming. Let's try to switch on the slides. Let's start in 1902. That's a picture from George Méliès's movie, one of the first sci-fi movies of all time, and it's based on a novel by Jules Verne. In a trip to the moon, 3 travelers undergo a series of adventures and misadventures. They successfully travel to the moon in a bullet-shaped projectile. Back in the days, that was a huge utopia. And 100 years after Jules Verne's book was published in 1870, the moon landing took place. So it basically predicted the moon landing. But today, we're in different times. Today, many people even doubt that we've ever been to the moon or that Earth is a sphere, which is something that we've known since the ancient Greek. Mad Mike, his words, not mine, wants to confirm this with his own eyes and launched a homemade rocket earlier this year. Spoiler, he didn't get too far. Speaking of space, in War of the Worlds, here an adaptation from 1953, the Mars invasion was stopped in its tracks when the advancing forces succumbed to what basically amounts to the common cold. Today, we are the ones invading foreign and unknown territory, and we are worried of bringing human bacteria to Mars. You can see it in the headline of Nature magazine, or The Guardian writes, "Don't let bacteria-laden humans contaminate Mars." In 1949, George Orwell published his famous book, 1984, a truly dystopian novel in which he describes a world full of surveillance and full of normalization. And we can see a lot of parallels when we look at today's products and systems and how they surveil us. Like in this tweet by Parker Higgins from 2015, where he compares the Samsung Smart TV privacy policy with a paragraph from 1984. And I want to read it out to you because it's a bit hard to read on the screen. So the privacy policy reads as following. Please be aware that if your spoken words include personal or other sensitive information, that information will be among the data captured and transmitted to a third party through your use of voice recognition. Let's compare that to the paragraph in 1984 that talks about telescreens. Any sound that Winston made above the level of a whisper would be picked up by it. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plague commanded, He could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment, how often or on what system. The thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. In the year 1968, 2001, A Space Odyssey popularized many sci-fi staples. Like this one, according to Samson, it predicted the iPad, described as foolscap-size news pads. Astronauts would use them to monitor the spaceship and do diagnostic checks, or they would communicate to Earth. Floyd, one of the characters, says, "Sometimes I wondered if the newspad and the fantastic technology behind it was the last word in man's quest for perfect communications. Here I am, far out in space, speeding away from Earth at thousands of miles an hour, yet in a few milliseconds I can see the headlines of any newspaper I please." But 2001 is even better known for supposedly subservient machines taking over. As a reminder, HAL 9000 is the sentient software and central nervous system of Discovery 1, a spaceship hurtling towards Jupiter. HAL performs duties such as monitoring the crew during hibernation, checking the vessels for faults, or outsmarting passengers in chess. But when one of the crew members chat shit behind HAL's hypothetical back, the computer lip-reads the exchange and proceeds to wreak revenge. With HAL 9000, Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick kind of predicted our obsession, or the rise of the obsession with artificial intelligence. Because we get news headlines like this one: Google's DeepMind AI can lip-read TV shows better than a pro. And here's a little something for the conspiracy theorists. The article was written by Hal Hudson. You don't have to search long when you're looking for examples where AI has gone wrong. Remember Microsoft's chatbot Tay, this experimental persona they created, who wandered radically off message when she started sprouting Nazi comments? Today, androids may not dream of electric sheep, but at least sheep will have real nightmares being haunted by electric werewolf sheeps, like from this newspaper article in Japan where farmers put together figures that looked like sheep werewolves and that basically should scare off predators from the herds. And while sheep dream of werewolves, some tech companies have been watching too much RoboCop and have wet dreams about AI and policing. Remember the plot? It's set in Detroit in 2028, and a massive corporation has just bought the local police department when a police officer called Murphy gets shot and he dies on duty. But because he has signed this contract that basically gives away his body or all his rights to a company, they revive him, they reanimate his body and implant weapons like facial recognition, predictive analytics, and the ability to transmit live video. And the company formerly known as Taser, now known as Exxon, they changed their name, apparently loves this movie so much that they are referring to it a lot in their company reports. They draw a lot of inspiration from the movie for their body cameras. You can see the body camera here. They're one of the biggest manufacturers of body cameras, and they say in their reports, quote, "Every cop will be RoboCop." And they announced that they will provide police departments in the nation with free body cameras, plus data storage and data processing, plus training and support. This is what their office looks like super cyber. And their second favorite movie is Minority Report, the movie with Tom Cruise, where he stands in front of this UI interface that helps him to predict crimes. And this is also known as predictive policing today, no surprise, where artificial intelligence basically meets policing. And now imagine law enforcement data being combined with real-life footage from these body cams and facial recognition. Well, there's plenty examples like this example from ProPublica that show us that there's big flaws when it comes to prediction software. This is a report that was released in 2016 that basically proves that software that has been used in law enforcement units across the country has bias against black people. Remember hoverboards? Actually, never mind. Let's talk about what's popular today. Black Mirror, for example. Despair and misery brought to you by technology. Fighter robots that are after you, or scoring systems, as found on Twitter and in China. That was a quick ride through 100 years of science fiction, like popular science fiction and very much selected pieces, but you can already see some of the predictions from these science fiction pieces came true and became basically self-fulfilling prophecies. So I'm wondering if this science fiction helped to create tools, and if self-fulfilling prophecies came true, maybe we can use that to our advantage. My name is Julia Kloiber, and I'm a fellow at the Mozilla Foundation, where I'm researching emerging technologies and their implications on society. Plus, I'm also researching new narratives, counter stories to visions, to mainstream tech visions, visions that companies come up with. And through this work, I did a lot of research where these dominant stories in tech come from. And something is very obvious when we look at tool and software development. There's only a handful of big companies that dominate the place. They create the tools and the narratives that influence our daily lives, our societies, and that also shape our future, because they have the means to do so. They have the resources to bring these visions to life. And of course, these visions are not coming into being in a vacuum. They're influenced by zeitgeist, by politics, by art, commerce, and as we've also already seen by science fiction. Research in human-computer interaction, for example, shows that many researchers acknowledge the role that science fiction has played in triggering their interest in science and also inspiring some breakthroughs. And indeed, there are many examples of technologies that have later emerged in the real world. Unfortunately, a lot of these sci-fi blueprints are rather dystopian. Many of the newer popular science fiction share a very pessimistic outlook. Their message is basically, technology is more likely to ruin our lives than to improve them. The New Yorker writes, radical pessimism is a dismal trend. Dystopia used to be a fiction of resistance. It's become a fiction of submission. The fiction of an untrusting, lonely, and sullen 21st century. The fiction of fake news and infowars. The fiction of helplessness and loneliness. It cannot imagine a better future, and it doesn't ask anyone to do so. It nurses grievances and indulges resentment. It calls for courage. It finds that cowardice suffices. Its only admonition is despair more. Picked what we stand to gain, while dystopias describe what we about to lose. So why is it so hard for us to come up with what we truly want? Studies in behavioral economics teach us that we are risk averse. We hate losing almost twice as much as we love to win. Dystopias are easier to imagine. They are conservative, they are cheap, based on conserving what we already have instead of the dangers of losing. Utopias believe in progress, dystopias don't. The title of this talk is Request for Optimism, and it's actually a call for optimism, a call to artists, writers, technologists, scientists, activists, all of you, a call for new visions. Just look at Star Trek, with a pretty diverse crew for that time and a Russian steering the ship in times of the Cold War. Mankind was united in reaching for the stars. Or the stories of Kim Stanley Robinson that keep alive the idea that humanity can create a better future for itself. In his books, the scientists are the heroes. His Mars is not an alien planet, but a landscape to be terraformed into radically new farms. Robinson's work illustrates both the promise and peril of radical utopianism, as well as the habits of ordinary people in extraordinary landscapes. Anyone can do dystopia. You just have to combine news headlines. That's what he says. But utopias are hard and important because we need to imagine what it might be like if we did things well enough to say to our kids, we did our best. This is as good as it was when it was handed to us. Take care of it and do better. And Kim Stanley Robinson also reminds me of solarpunk, a speculative movement that's built on this notion of using solar power to create green worlds, green and sustainable worlds. It's a collaborative effort to imagine and design a world of prosperity, peace, and sustainability. In solarpunk fiction, both electric and political power are distributed horizontally. And unlike cyberpunks and steampunks, solarpunks are optimistic. The sky is blue, the fashion is festive, and the city is drowned in greenery. This is a future worth fighting for. And so are the futures of Ursula Le Guin. In her book, The Left Hand of Darkness, she deconstructs gender binarism. In the book, the inhabitants of Gethen can become either male or female at various times. And because each person can swap gender, the Genethian society doesn't know the concept of gender rules. Nothing is impossible. There's a lot of potential for change. Ursula Le Guin says, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and challenged by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, in the art of words." In this spirit, I want to show you 3 examples of resistance and artistic practice that give me optimism and hope for the future. Examples that are not as mainstream as the science fiction examples that I've been showing you before, but hold a lot of positivity for a time that is yet to come. I want to start out with Adrienne Maree Brown. She's an American author, a Black feminist, a women's rights activist. She lives in Detroit. In her work, Adrienne highlights the potential of science fiction for communities and also the importance for it. She says all organizing is science fiction. It's about bending the future together into something we have never experienced. A world where everyone experiences abundance, access, pleasure. There's no wars, dignity, freedom, justice, and peace. Adrienne is inspired by works of other Black sci-fi writers like Octavia Butler or Samuel Delany. She uses the term visionary fiction for the things that she writes. She says that speculative fiction could be a place to intentionally practice the futures we long for, so an experimentation ground to see what might a world without prisons look like and what might a world without borders and war look like. In visionary fiction, we center around marginalized people. It's about collective change, about aiming neither for dystopia nor utopia. It's about finding the space in the middle, a realistic middle ground. Because she says we've noticed around us that utopia and dystopia coexist. Adrienne has co-edited this book called Octavia's Brood that features science fiction stories from the social justice movement in the US, where she dreams up these worlds without prisons and borders. Things that seem to be impossible are made possible in these stories. Because only if we can imagine something, then we can actually act upon it. Only if we have these powerful visuals in our head, we can start to rock towards it and convince others to join our cause. And Adrienne is not only a writer, she's also a facilitator in the US. So she helps others to create their own fiction and to get together in workshops. I've picked Adrienne's example because her texts are the opposite of the mainstream examples that I showed you in the beginning. They focus on minorities. They focus on those who are left out in the big visions of the sci-fi utopianists. They focus on minorities and their dreams. The stories have a clear goal. They challenge norms and help to create a more inclusive and open society. Let's move on from visionary writing to visionary technology to a place called Dynamic Land in Oakland, California, where technologists, designers, researchers, community activists are developing a dynamic medium for all the people. Stepping into dynamic land is a little bit like stepping into the future of computation. A future that is not driven by computers that let you only access information or process information, but way more radical, a future that basically enhances your activities as a human. It's not designed for consumption and information, but for a desire to collaborate, to explore, and to understand with others. This idea is also reflected in the works of early computer pioneers like Doug Engelbart or Alan Kay. They wanted computers to augment our ability. They wanted to create authoring environments for powerful ideas. They say that access to information has its benefits, but we do not have full agency unless we really understand and unless we are really fluent in this new medium. Let me show what this looks like, what computing at dynamic land looks like, because it's a bit hard to understand only by describing. The current technology is cameras and projectors in the ceiling. There's no interfaces. They got rid of the interfaces. You don't need a computer or something that blocks you from other participants. So you can interact with physical objects and with paper. And information is basically beamed on the pieces, and all the programming code is on these pieces of papers that you can modify. Dynamic land is centered around communities. It's not just about technology. It's about getting rid of these interfaces, and it's about getting rid of hurdles that it's about lowering barriers for people. The medium serves the people and helps them to develop new concepts and ideas. They say that the computer of the future is not a product, it's a place that you can walk into. Dynamic land is a community space in the possible future, and a lot of people say that it feels like walking into the future, like in the year 2070 or something. I'm not sure whether dynamic land was inspired by science fiction, but it definitely counters the dystopian sci-fi narratives in which only a few are in power and technology is something mystical rather than something practical that enhances human capabilities. Dynamic land is its own piece of visionary fiction that, similar like Adrian's fiction, helps communities to organize and to create and shape their own visions of the future. Visionary ideas are not all from the US. This is Audrey Tang. She's a hacker, an animal rights activist, and a truly inspiring person. And since 2016, she's also the digital minister of Taiwan. She's a transgender woman who describes herself as a conservative anarchist. She doesn't take any orders. Audrey believes in citizen participation, in radical transparency, and in intersectionality. She has been running many really successful citizen participation programs where she enables citizens to deliberate on policy changes and where people can also take influence on policies. Before becoming a minister, Audrey used to be active in the civic hacker group in Taiwan called GovZero. She's been working on tools that improve neighborhoods and cities. And she was also part of a peaceful occupation of the parliament in 2014, also known as the Sunflower Movement, that actually changed quite some things, because a lot of people from this occupation, from this movement, joined public administration and joined governments and helped government to become more open and to transparent and to enable citizens to participate. And I'm mentioning Audrey because she wrote this really cool poem when they asked her to write a job description, because she doesn't take orders, so she wouldn't write a job description. She wrote this poem or prayer instead, and it reflects her beliefs and values really well. It reads as follows: when we see an internet of things, let's make it an internet of beings. When we see virtual reality, let's make it shared reality. When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, let's make it human experience. And when we hear that singularity is near, let's always remember that plurality is here. I love this poem. I love it because it gets right to the core. It's not about technology. Technology will change all the time. It's about values and visions. They will carry us a long way. Art, design, and other practices can help to get these visions to life. This is a call for new narrative. new narratives. This is not a call for only utopia. This is also a call for new visions, a call to counter corporate narratives. Future is plural, and there's many futures. In order to come up with these diverse futures, we need diverse teams. We need people from many different backgrounds to tell us about their dreams and hopes. Our utopia could be someone else's dystopia. This is why it's important to look at things from many different angles. I hope that by designing more optimistic outlooks, these too can become self-fulfilling prophecies. And maybe we actually get some hoverboards too. Thank you.
I think I'd like a hoverboard. I'd like the hoverboard, yes. Thank you so much, Julia, for your talk. It was very optimistic. It was also, in a way, somewhat in contrast to the keynote that we had yesterday by Adam Greenfield. We briefly spoke about that afterwards. And one thing that struck me in your talk was that you said, giving the example of dynamic land, we can augment ourselves if we understand what we're working on, if we understand what technology can do, if we understand what other scenarios we can create. And I think the message from Adam yesterday was we don't understand the kind of the superstructural algorithms that govern our lives. So how would you see that? How would you respond to the element of understanding technologies today?
Yeah, I don't agree with this notion. Yeah, it struck me yesterday. It was on one slide, right? I was not even sure whether he was super serious about it, that like technology is this mystical thing that we can't wrap our head around, or that's going to, like the singularity is near basically. There's these black boxes and we'll just not understand what they're doing. And in my work, I'm actually always doing the opposite. I'm trying to demystify technology because I don't think that it's a mystery and that it's magic that's happening. And I think it's also tricky when we look at the example from ProPublica. When you have AI systems in place that do risk assessments that basically might influence a judge in whether to like give someone probation or not, you cannot go to this person and shrug like, hey, this is what the AI spit out. Like, we don't know where it came from, right? People have to have the opportunity for fair trials and decisions. We have to make sure that we know where decisions are coming from and that it's not this black box. And we have to be aware of baked-in biases, because all of this, talking about the predictive policing systems, all of these systems are fed with data from the past 10, 20 years. And if you have a society or if you have some institutions that are racist, then this racism is baked into this data. And then the algorithm that you put, that you feed this data to will spit out racist results. And I don't think that we can hide behind like, oh, we don't understand what's going on and sorry.
But how would we do that? Because indeed, if some of the examples you gave, and I know that some of the work that you also produce in Code for Germany, so this is an open source program, if you will, or fund where lots of people can add their own programs and their own programming for the benefit of many. So many of the examples I understood were on a kind of like local level, right? So people could understand technologies so that they could, sense the air quality in their houses. And this is, I think, miles away from indeed the algorithms that are made to help judges make decisions.
Yeah, but in this specific case with ProPublica, they actually later had a trial where a company was more or less forced to open up their source code so that other researchers could get a look to what data is being fed into it, how it's being categorized and so on. So they had to open source their code, even though they said that it's like at the heart of their business model, because that's the argument that you hear all of the time. We cannot open source stuff or increase transparency because our business model would be flawed. But that's an example, like open sourcing things and giving others the ability to look into the code. And of course, it's not going to be the average citizen that's going to take a look at the repository, but researchers and other tech companies.
And at least they have the opportunity to look at that code.
Yeah, if it's open source, yeah. But then, of course, it's not as easy as it sounds, right? But still, you at least have the opportunity and a little bit of transparency and see what is being fed into it.
Yeah, yeah. I love the examples of science fiction that you gave. Of course, Orwell was there, the telescreen. I also remember that example of indeed people finding out that their televisions were actually listening to them, and I remember that when television was first introduced in many of the homes, people were indeed afraid that if they could look at the television, then of course the television could look back. And I was also reminded of how indeed companies use these examples of science fiction to play perhaps with their image, play perhaps also with how that image can be reverted. So there's the famous Apple ad, of course, Orwellian based. And I was also reminded of Samsung when it first released its smartwatch. It brought out an ad that would showcase every popular culture manifestation of a smartwatch. So there was the Jetsons, and there was Dick Tracy, and there was Kit, the Knight Rider, etc. And then the tagline was, "It's finally here." That was the tagline, "It's finally here." And you mentioned in your talk that, of course, it's the big companies that can make that a reality, right? So that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Wouldn't you say that the self-fulfilling prophecy is mostly technical, though, and not cultural, social, right? So if you make predictions, then, of course, these large companies can make the technology work, and they can make the algorithms, perhaps, or the material manifestations. But many of the predictions based on, so this will actually improve stuff, or this will make this better, they don't last as well as the technological predictions. So how would you?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of everything. With technology, what we see a lot of times is that, hey, something new is possible, so let's do it. Like, there's no reason for not trying it out or not experimenting with products that monitor, I don't know, your heart rate, or like record your voice or track wherever you are. I'm just worried, or there's always like, what are these developments driven by? And a lot of times they are driven by efficiency, right? It's not like efficiency that helps you to be quicker at certain things, that makes you more efficient, that helps you to get up once an hour. I think the Apple Watch constantly reminds you to do that. And they are trying to get rid of a lot of like, things that make humans human, like boredom, like they are trying to get rid of friction, right? And it sounds great, a frictionless world, a world where you don't have to stand at the cash register and wait in line. But then this like friction in our everyday life might also give us opportunities to daydream or to chat with other people and so on. So it might be like inspiring for our creativity, and I think it's a it's a dystopia when we get rid of all of this friction and when we are super efficient human beings, just like machines. Like, it's all about efficiency. I think that's a big trap, and that's what we see with a lot of tech products these days.
Yeah. And how do you see that in the utopian examples in fiction, for instance? Are most of them indeed aimed at or based on reaching efficiency? Because I think some of the examples that you gave clearly go against that idea of efficiency. But would you say that indeed these companies become inspired by utopian fiction because they are mostly about efficiency?
Yeah, if efficiency is their utopia, then yeah, I guess so.
Because most of the utopian fictions, of course, when we know that they eventually turn into dystopias, is because they offer blueprints. And whenever you have blueprints, then there's a clear goal. And then when you know where that goal is, then you have clear steps to reach that goal. So could you perhaps share a little bit of some of the experiences you have and how you see people offering these counter stories, right? Where there's much more room to perhaps not only not think of efficiency, but also think of utopia as not being about blueprints?
I mean, it's also not too much about like super utopian visions, right? It can be like, I think you said like pragmatism, like what pragmatic utopias?
Pragmatic utopianism.
Yeah. So what is something that we can actually achieve? I mean, the call of the name of this talk was also not request for utopia. It was a call for more optimism, and I think there is a difference between the two, and a call for optimism is something where you're not only asking a certain percentage of the population to share their optimism with the crowds, but also like a wider range of people. And I think a lot of what we see in this like sci-fi books, novels, like most of the writers are male, most of the people in the tech companies who develop these projects are male, mostly from a certain class, mostly from a certain like Western part of the world. And I think by looking at Adrienne Marie Brown or Dynamic Land, that can really help us to like grasp or go to the core of the problem, that a lot of things are super mainstream, that a lot of things are reigned by a certain class or a certain gender.
I was indeed very much happy to see solar punk being introduced here, and I also heard the audience gasping perhaps a bit at the image that you showed, because this just looks like, I think, a world where everyone would like to live in. At the same time, these are images of I think, societies that would need to be constructed on this kind of like grander scale. And this was also something I was touched upon in the talk yesterday with Adam Greenfield. How would you see some of the kind of like smaller scale experiments and tinkering that you see a lot? How do you see those scale up to such a level that indeed we could create some of the more larger societal, beneficial, optimistic outlooks?
Yeah, I mean, climate change is a good example here, because for a lot of years we always thought about climate change as a UN level issue, right? So the UN has to take like steps in order to prevent climate change. But over the years we've seen cities stepping up, cities be leading this movement, cities taking steps and then influencing policies. And I think no one would have thought that like local communities or cities could like influence politics and policies on a global level. So I think it is always useful to like scale down and to look at like what's surrounding myself, and where can I start to do things, and what might have a bigger impact and influence on like bigger structures. And it's also useful to break down topics, right? Because when we talk about topics on a like national level or international level, a lot of the things are super abstract and don't relate to your everyday life. So it can be really helpful to focus on the hyperlocal and just see like, who are my neighbors? What are their like background stories? What are their dreams and hopes?
And I love how indeed dreams and hopes are used as indeed very in their pragmatic sense. And you also mentioned the word daydream just now. And I think this is indeed where a lot of the ideas that I actually saw arise in like 100 years ago in the 1920s. This was the German philosopher Ernst Bloch, who wrote Das Prinzip Hoffnung, so the principle of hope, where he also said that in most cases utopias, when they are seen as blueprints and they then give people a goal to go towards, that is actually very restrictive. And what he actually liked to see was people daydream more, where he'd say everyday opportunities, everyday experiments to think of how your life might become better, that's actually much more preferred to designing a utopia that everyone should gather around that idea, and then all as like a larger group should find that end goal. And he's instead said, no, we should encourage much more this daydreaming. Now you mentioned the word speculative here, so you would say this is kind of like speculative dreaming, perhaps, or speculative designing.
Yeah, we've been working quite a lot with speculative design lately, where you basically come up with prototypes or stories and you develop them, so that you can like test them and present them to a wider audience and see what works and what doesn't work. So we did prototypes around the voice-enabled internet, like a little similar to Alexa, but then different at the same time, because we were experimenting with what if you had more like visual feedback, like when this thing is like actually on and recording stuff. Because a lot of times, like when you're visiting people, you don't like know whether they have these devices, whether they are switched on and so on. So we were exploring like the privacy aspects of these devices. But we're also like working on a new project called speculative, or based on the idea of speculative tourism by a friend, Mushan Sarawi from Israel. So he developed the concept of audio tours. You would walk through Jerusalem, listen to this audio tour, and the audio tour is basically a walking tour set in the future, like set 100 years from now. And it helps you to experience your neighborhood or a certain part of the world and view it from a very different angle. And I'm very much interested in this new forms of storytelling, or how you can immerse people into future narratives, or maybe also utopias or dystopias in their vicinities. And it's not always about VR, right? Sometimes it can be as easy as an audio tour, because an audio tour is also something that then people can also create themselves. You can host workshops, and they can come up with their own audio tours of their neighborhoods. So we've been working a lot with speculative fiction, and we've also been working a lot with a method called backcasting. That's a methodology from the 1990s, where you come up with either very like utopian vision or dystopian vision in the far or not so far future, and then you work backwards. So you look at like, who are the stakeholders that are involved in this vision, whom do you have to reach out to in order to make this happen. So you work step by step backwards into the present in order to prevent something or make something happen.
I think those are amazing exercises. I'll actually use that one for my students, I think, next time I teach. Before I open up the questions to the floor, one final question. I need to know, what's your favorite science fiction movie?
That's a tough question. I really liked Back into the Future. Yeah.
1, 2, 3?
3?
Let's have the people in the audience also ask questions. Let someone have the microphone transported to you. Yeah. And if you could also state your name.
Okay, I'm Victor. I was very intrigued by like your sort of contrast between optimism and pessimism, and I find myself a lot, because I think about these exact same things like that was in this presentation a lot. It's also my focus area, and I'm kind of like torn between like the realization of the necessity of optimism as like a cultural mindset. You know, like without this cultural mindset, it will get even worse. Like, but at the same time, I'm also a pessimist from like the realization of the state of affairs in the world when it comes to like climate, like the sort of political atmosphere, and the state of technology in the way that it is now. So I was wondering, do you have any like ways or sort of almost like techniques to how to keep yourself optimistic in the midst of like so many things that sort of drag you towards pessimism all the time?
Yeah, great question. I'm, and we haven't mentioned this, I think. So I'm working on a lot of programs in Germany. One is, for example, called the Prototype Fund. It's a funding program for open source projects, and mainly technology projects that focus on the common good, or how can society benefit from technology. And I'm very much like inspired by these projects. We're funding like almost 200 individuals and small teams via this program, and the tools range from an open source menstrual cycle tracker to tools that help to archive crime against humanity in Syria. So there's a lot of people working on technology that society benefits from, and I'm inspired by the work of those people, and that's where I get my optimism from. And I also think that to be pessimistic is something like it's a privilege, right? I mean, if you're in a really bad position, you can sometimes not afford to be pessimistic. You have to be optimistic. So maybe it's also something that we who live in countries where we have welfare and security can like indulge in. We sit in our living rooms and we watch like dystopias on television, whereas other people who are not in this position have to be optimistic about the next day and about their lives getting better. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so not being optimistic is not an option, or...
Yeah, not for me, yeah. And not for many people.
I'm also indeed reminded of the work by Viktor Frankl, who also wrote that you know, the emotion of knowing that, or wanting to know that there's a better place, right? That hope is something that we all know and should engage with, actually. I do agree that at times it becomes difficult, right? So I think being surrounded by many of the like open source experiments that you mentioned, I think that helps. So to envelop yourself in that optimism.
I mean, it always coexists, right? Optimism and pessimism, I guess. I mean, you can't like read the news today and be like super optimistic, I guess. But it really depends on also what you make out of it, or what privilege you have to make something out of it. So, yeah.
Not reading news, by the way. That's a great way to not. News is to your brain as sugar is to your body. Other questions? In the right on the the lady on the.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I liked a lot the slide of the sentences by Audrey from Taiwan. Was it what her name? And the piece about dynamic land, the paper interface collaboration tool. I'm really curious about your perspective on people around technology, or not even around like emerging technologies, but just people collaborating. And a lot of the times, like the emotional part of collaboration, like even if we're talking about e-democracy platforms and people they become so technical. They like all the platforms have a very technocratic perspective on collaboration, and I like the dynamic land. And at the same time, my eyes sparked really when I saw the sentence about like user experience to human experience, because for me that takes even the perspective of a dynamic land even one step further about human emotions to collaborate together. Like what's your vision on that towards these not utopic scenarios, but more optimistic scenarios?
So I think we like tools like the one at Dynamic Lands, where you work or collaborate with communities and groups. There's always that always involves friction, right? It's never as frictionless as if you're just like you and yourself in front of your iPad and like clicking away. Working with groups involves friction, and I think we have to embrace this friction. This is also something that Adam mentioned yesterday, that it's not only about like efficiency, but that collaboration, and if you really go to the ground of problems and issues, then you can't avoid friction. And it's similar with Audrey and the GovTech tools that she builds. I myself did a lot of open data and transparency work in the last couple of years, and I always had this vision of, once all the information is freely available to everyone, we'll have better democracy, more fair democracies, and that's just not what happens a lot of the time, because that's just the first step, right? Opening up information and increasing transparency, but then you need this other layer of really enabling people, like helping people to get agency and creating tools so they can use information that's out there, that they can interpret information, and have the literacy to deal with it. So when it comes to collaboration, there's various steps. There's the easy steps where you just open something up or develop a tool, and then there's the hard steps where you test the tool with users, where you collaborate in groups and people have different opinions or have different threat models when it comes to technology. We can also see that with diverse teams in companies. The outcome, the products get better when the teams are diverse, but people don't necessarily get more happy because, of course, there's a lot of friction in these teams because there's different opinions about stuff, and you constantly have to, try to get your voice heard or like your argument across, and you have to negotiate with others and find a common denominator. So, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks.
There was one question right over there next to you. Yes.
Well, maybe can you give more examples of what technology can do in those processes of decision making and friction? Because what is the difference between just being there together with all these different perspectives and trying to make sense out of it? What can technology then do extra to make that easier?
So in Taiwan, they had a pretty cool example. They had a decision-making process around Uber was just introduced there like 3 or 4 years ago. And politicians had to come up with a law to figure out like what are the laws that Uber has to stick to and negotiate between Uber and taxi drivers. And they made a huge deliberative forum out of that. So they had an online forum where people could state their opinion, but they couldn't comment on other people's opinion. And that was kind of a cool trick or feature of their tool. So you had all these opinions and they were being clustered. So you could see what are the like feelings in the communities, like what do people think about a certain issue, and this clustering of different opinions helped people to wrap their head around like different viewpoints and also come to some suggestions. So they agreed on something they put forward to the politicians via this tool that helped them to see like what are other people thinking, and maybe I'm not so far away from like other people's opinions. So that's one of the tools that I can highly recommend. It's called Polis by some people from Seattle, I believe. And they've been doing this with hundreds of thousands of people, so it's not just a small group of people participating. Plus, and I think that's also special about their approach, they had also the opportunity for people to join in-person meetings. So they did not only have the digital tool, they also had the opportunity for everyone who's maybe not online or doesn't want to be online to join meetings and get their voice heard in the meetings.
Other questions? Right over there in the middle. Oh, sorry.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi.
Sorry.
Thank you for the talk. I find it really interesting what you're speaking about. As like a fiction writer, I was thinking a lot about the responsibility of the author. Is it on? Yeah.
It is,
and like producing cultural desire for technology, and it made me think about this notion of hyperstition and like bringing into reality things through imagination. But my question is regarding, I don't know if you're aware of a company called Sci Futures from LA. I think they're from LA, which is basically an agency which hires, I guess, out of work science fiction writers to create narratives for brands, for companies, basically from a spectrum from like the most dystopian vision of their product to an optimistic version. And then they kind of use that as PR or internal research. And they kind of co-opt it and inoculate themselves against critique. And I wondered if you had any comments or thoughts on this idea of like how capitalism can kind of reintegrate these critiques, and also what it means for people who maybe this is the only job they can get, which is, writing in these kind of ways. I don't know.
Do you have an example about what
I
they
can't-
build?
No, it's basically an agency, and there's hundreds of companies. So it might be for the Samsung TV, and someone will write like the worst possible way that this technology could be used, like a really dystopian way, and then this story will just become an internal piece of copyrighted information that this company holds, and then they'll kind of try and avoid that becoming a real scenario, or they'll use PR to kind of deflect the reality that might actually happen or something.
Yeah, or with ad targeting, you can just serve the future to like different audiences, right? To serve like futures to people that they want to hear about.
Exactly.
Like as I said, like someone else's like dystopia might be someone's utopia might be someone else's dystopia, and via ad targeting and a lot about the stuff online is all evolving all about like advertisements and how to target information better, like this whole data collection. And I guess one of their business models might be like serving these utopias or dystopias on a silver tablet to the people who want to hear it. I did not include the Truman Show in the films, but the Truman Show is like the total filter bubble, right? I mean, it basically it's also partly the world in that we're living in right now. When we go online, we're in our small bubbles where we hear stuff that we want to hear and where we don't hear from a lot of other people. So maybe that's their business model, but I don't know them. But I'll research them. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks.
I'm also reminded of a discussion I had with someone who was also very much an expert on science fiction, and she said that increasingly people become more of experts of science fiction themselves because there are so many science fiction movies and novels out there. So increasingly more people will be able actually to envision all these kind of these spectra of dystopia versus utopia. So increasingly, also indeed, these companies, I gather, indeed, kind of like hire these people to create their own kind of brand or company-specific Black Mirror episodes, and therefore indeed harvest all these ideas that people will, in the end, already know because they've seen them. They've seen them already. Yeah. There was one question in the middle. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Andre, and my favorite sci-fi film is 12 Monkeys. And I was wondering about this, I see a lot of understandably very sort of network and interdisciplinary sort of approaches here, and I'm wondering what kind of, to pull it back to like the individual level, what the role of maybe notions such as, say, introspection on an ethical or spiritual level or whatever can have to do with guiding us in this kind of optimistic direction, and how things like how pulling it back to the individual might possibly counteract some of the downsides of, say, inaccessibility to some of these networks via a lack of technical know-how, or you know, I mean, I think for a lot of people, things like open source are like similar to like crypto. Yeah, it's a great idea, but how do I get my hands on some, and what do I do with it when I have some, you know? And and how do we kind of, as maybe individuals, can navigate this kind of potentially optimistic landscape, even if we don't know what the hell to do with open source technology?
Do you mean how do we spread literacy, or how do we?
Well, both. I actually kind of had two questions, but in the course of the last question, it kind of got conflated in one in my head, so I'm improvising. But like I was curious about how do we kind of make the access more democratic. Say, people might have great ideas but no technical education, for example, and also how can we like sort of use our relationship with ourselves, as in who am I, what am I doing, why am I doing it, as a way of kind of guiding our kind of mapping out this new, say, dystopian, utopian the technological landscape.
Yeah, I think this is what also like dynamic land does, right? Like lowering the barriers and not hiding behind like abstract topics like open source or open data, but maybe not even mentioning these concepts and still like engaging with them in a way, right? So when I was working on open data, like in the beginning, I used to mention like that term like all the time, and I would always like a conversation would always start with a quick explanation of the term open data. But after a while, I realized like why don't we like it sometimes helps to get rid of these abstract terms and to start talking about what you're actually trying to achieve with something. And it also helps you to sometimes focus on the things that you really want to do, right? Because a lot of times it's easy to hide behind abstract terms and abstract concepts and to never really ask the question like, why am I doing this? What am I trying to challenge? And what is at the center of the stuff that I want to do? Is it the abstract concept and the technology, or is it a certain need that I'm trying to fulfill with it, or that a certain problem that I'm trying to solve with it? And I agree, there's like too little literacy in a lot of areas, and the barriers for entrance are high, right? I mean, if we look at, and I think you mentioned it in the preparation, Wikipedia or like earlier forms of archives of knowledge. Wikipedia now is a format where theoretically everyone can like contribute their like knowledge too, but then when you look at the statistics, like 9% of the authors are women and the rest is men, and it's quite tricky these days to get something into Wikipedia. And if you look at a lot of people who are just starting to access the internet and they are accessing it via smartphones, it might be even more difficult to edit Wikipedia via a smartphone because it's just more tedious. So there's a lot of barriers to entry and a lot of literacy that has to be increased in some areas and able to really encourage and enable people to participate.
We have time for one final question. I'll have that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yesterday, Adam Greenfield cited Illich, who said something like that socialism will arrive by bike, and the bicycle was invented already over 100 of years ago. So my question is about maybe also pursuing the train of thought from over there. What do we really need from technology that we do not already have? If you consider, for instance, the waste of food, the waste of human potential, the waste of commons like the bike. So why do we need optimistic utopias when all these means are already around?
I mean, I guess it also depends whom you mean when you say we, because there's different cultural backgrounds and also different environments we live in, right? We might feel that we have everything, we're all connected, but there's a huge percentage of the world that it doesn't have access to internet or access to knowledge or the ability to read. So I think it's always helpful to reflect on like yourself and where you stand in a certain discussion, and in order to figure out what you need or want, or what you could open up for others. Yeah.
I think that's a very good way to wrap this up. Thank you so much again, Julia Kloiber, for the lecture. And thank you for your questions.